November 12, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Robert Bobby Sweeney gripped the control yoke of his P-38 Lightning, heart hammering against his ribs as the twin engines roared, slicing through the humid morning air. Below him, a formation of Japanese A6M Zeros streaked across the cobalt expanse, sunlight glinting off their aluminum skins. In less than a minute, the survival of his squadron and the outcome of the air battle would hinge on the reliability of his guns. Sweeney pressed the trigger. A sharp crack, crack, crack should have erupted from the nose-mounted M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, but instead came an eerie silence. The guns had jammed. Time slowed. A Zero swung in from starboard, its pilot's eyes cold and calculating. Sweeney yanked the stick, manoeuvring desperately, but every evasive action demanded the return fire he no longer had. One moment of mechanical failure had turned him from hunter into prey. By the end of the sortie, reports would record that 5 P-38s failed to destroy a single enemy fighter due to gun malfunctions. Across Guadalcanal and the broader Pacific Theater, similar failures plagued the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF. According to the Pacific Theater Operational Survey, approximately 17% of fighter sorties in late 1942 were compromised by gun jams, misfires, or feed system failures. The statistics were more than numbers, they were bodies. Pilots returned with empty barrels, burnt-out shells, and an enduring sense of frustration. The M2 Browning .50 caliber had been designed to dominate. Introduced in the 1930s and mounted on everything from B-17 bombers to P-38 fighters, it was the pinnacle of American small arms engineering. A short, recoil-operated, belt-fed machine gun capable of 750 to 850 rounds per minute. In theory, it was perfect. In practice, at high rates of fire in tropical heat, the gun was an unpredictable predator. Barrel warping, feed strip misalignment, and overheating were persistent issues. Even a minor deviation in shell alignment or a slightly warped belt link could freeze the gun mid-burst. The problem was compounded by the P-38's nose configuration. Unlike wing-mounted guns, the 4 M2s in the nose fired in a synchronized convergence pattern. Ideally, rounds met at a point 300 yards ahead, maximizing lethality. But in the real world of Guadalcanal and New Guinea, even a slight miscalibration or minor mechanical hiccup could turn a carefully aimed volley into wasted noise. By the summer of 1942, frontline pilots were reporting guns freezing cold or sputtering and stalling mid-pass, exactly when split-second accuracy mattered most. While Sweeney struggled over Guadalcanal, thousands of miles away in Springfield, Massachusetts, a civilian named John D. Clark stared at a workbench cluttered with Browning M2 components. Clark was a man who spoke more fluently in microns, tolerances, and recoil springs than in everyday conversation. He had joined the war effort as a civilian machinist and ordnance specialist, recruited for his expertise in small arms reliability. Unlike the engineers embedded in Lockheed or the military bureaucracy, Clark had no rank, no uniform, only a relentless curiosity and a growing obsession. Why America's .50 caliber guns, the supposed backbone of fighter lethality, failed when their pilots needed them most. Clark's day began with stacks of returned guns. Some had jammed after a single pass, others had fired hundreds of rounds before refusing to cycle. Using precision gauges, he measured each component, noting microscopic variances in feed tray angles, spring tensions, and chamber tolerances. "Every jam tells a story," he muttered to his assistant, Harold Jenkins, one October morning. "We just need to read it right." His observations were meticulous. A .50 caliber round generated extreme friction and heat at sustained rates of fire. In combat conditions, humid, salt-saturated air, sudden altitude shifts, the metal expanded unpredictably, sometimes causing the bolt to stick. Certain lots of ammunition produced hastily to meet wartime demand exhibited inconsistent case dimensions, exacerbating the problem. Clark realized that the solution wouldn't be simple lubrication or a minor tweak. It would require something engineers had considered impossible, a mechanical adjustment that allowed the guns to tolerate variation, dissipate heat, and cycle flawlessly, even under sustained fire. Back over Guadalcanal, Sweeney's squadron regrouped after the disastrous sortie. Overhead, the sun burned through patches of cloud, glinting on another formation of enemy aircraft. Pilots exchanged grim nods. They had trusted their guns, and the guns had failed them. Official reports noted that between October and December 1942, P-38 squadrons lost an estimated 23 aircraft in direct engagements where weapon malfunction prevented defensive or offensive fire. Morale among pilots was fragile. They called the M2 the cold gun when it froze mid-burst, a nickname whispered with equal parts fear and frustration. Clark, meanwhile, continued his experiments in the factory basement, often late into the night. He tested belt feeds, experimented with recoil buffer adjustments, and trialed new spring designs. He even simulated combat conditions, pouring salt water over barrels, running continuous bursts at maximum cyclic rate, and measuring thermal expansion with micrometer precision. Each failure brought him closer to understanding the complex dance between metallurgy, ammunition consistency, and mechanical geometry. By early December, Clark's hands were blistered, his eyes strained from microscopic inspection. Yet there was a glimmer of breakthrough, a subtle modification to the feed tray angle combined with an altered spring tension. It was unorthodox, seemingly impossible, and unlikely to receive immediate approval from military engineers. But Clark knew that if this worked, it could transform the air war. P-38s, P-47s, and later P-51s could finally unleash their full firepower without hesitation, giving pilots like Sweeney a fighting chance against enemy formations in the Pacific, North Africa, and Europe. In the Pacific, the clock was ticking. Every jammed gun could cost a life, a bomber, or even a critical air campaign. Yet in Springfield, Clark prepared silently, meticulously, for the moment when his impossible civilian trick would move from the bench to the skies, an innovation that would redefine what pilots expected from their weapons and ultimately the fate of the war itself. By the end of 1942, the problem was clear. American pilots needed their .50 caliber guns to perform flawlessly. Every jam, every misfire was a lesson etched in fire and sweat. And somewhere in Massachusetts, John D. Clark was preparing the solution, a solution that would soon make the cold gun a relic of the past. Springfield, Massachusetts, December 1942. The factory floor at Browning's Springfield Armory was a cacophony of clanging metal, whirring lathes, and the low hum of electric grinders. But in one corner, tucked behind stacks of crates and milling machines, John D. Clark worked in near silence. While the world outside celebrated Christmas and braced for another harsh winter, Clark's mind was locked entirely on one problem, the .50 caliber M2, and why it refused to function flawlessly under the punishing conditions of aerial combat. Clark was an unassuming man, standing just over 5'8", wiry, with oil-stained hands and wire-rimmed glasses that perpetually slipped down his nose. He didn't command teams or attend strategy meetings. He didn't need to. His battlefield was the workbench, his enemy an intricate alloy of steel, brass, and spring tension. Each gun brought to him from Guadalcanal or Europe carried its own story of failure. Some would jam after 10 rounds, others would fire hundreds before seizing completely. Clark catalogued each malfunction meticulously, cross-referencing with flight logs from the USAAF Victory Credits Board and combat reports from the Pacific Theater Strategic Survey. The problem, he realized, was multifaceted. The M2's design was robust, excessively so for infantry applications, but in a fighter's nose, firing at sustained rates of 750 to 850 rounds per minute, It became a finely tuned instrument that demanded perfection in every component. Any deviation in the belt feed, slight warping of the bolt, or heat-induced expansion of the chamber could induce a catastrophic jam. Tropical environments like Guadalcanal were particularly unforgiving. Humidity caused brass cartridges to swell, while salt-laden air corroded delicate surfaces. Clark examined a .50 caliber barrel under a magnifying loupe. "See here," he said to his assistant Harold Jenkins, who leaned over the workbench. "These slight burrs, barely noticeable, are enough to throw off the cycling. And with the belt tension inconsistent across production lots, you get exactly what the pilots describe: mid-pass failures." The two men had experimented with countless solutions: lubrication formulas, altered firing pin tolerances, modified recoil springs. All had improved performance marginally, but none eliminated the problem. Then, one evening, Clark sat quietly, tracing the path of the cartridge as it moved from belt to chamber, considering the forces acting on it: friction, heat, rapid expansion, and the violent backward motion of the bolt. He thought about the synchronized firing of the 4 nose guns on the P-38, how they converged at a point hundreds of yards ahead, and how milliseconds of delay could ruin accuracy or worse, cause the guns to seize. And then, almost by accident, he saw it. A principle so simple that it had been overlooked in the rush of wartime production. A slight precession in the feed tray angle, combined with a marginally increased bolt spring tension, could allow the cartridge to align perfectly under high rates of fire, absorbing thermal expansion without jamming. It was elegant in its simplicity, yet to military engineers it would appear almost miraculous. A civilian had, in essence, solved a problem that had bedeviled trained ordnance officers for years. Clark spent the next week fabricating test rigs. Using surplus barrels and belt assemblies, he simulated the extreme conditions of aerial combat. He applied salt water to mimic the humid Pacific climate, ran continuous bursts, and measured thermal expansion with micrometer precision. By the end of December, he had produced the first M2 assembly that consistently fired 1,500 rounds in simulated combat without a single malfunction. Word of his success spread cautiously through the Springfield Armory. Lieutenant Colonel James Hargrove, overseeing the production line, arrived to inspect the results. "Clark," he said, examining a test firing report, "these results, they're unprecedented. No squadron's guns have run this clean in the field." Clark, typically reserved, allowed himself a small nod. He didn't relish accolades. He relished the certainty that pilots would live because of this work. The next challenge was bureaucratic. Military procurement officers were hesitant to implement a civilian's unorthodox solution. "We'll need full test certification, wartime approvals, and possibly retraining for armourers," one officer said dismissively. Clark, patient and meticulous, simply documented every adjustment, every trial, and every successful burst. By mid-January 1943, the War Department approved a limited field deployment. P-38 squadrons in the Pacific would receive retrofitted M2s incorporating Clark's modifications. Meanwhile, pilots remained unaware of the impending revolution in their weaponry. Over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, sorties continued to report mid-pass jams, missed kills, and the terrifying vulnerability of an unarmed fighter. But Clark's work was already en route. The new assemblies were crated and shipped under top priority, accompanied by detailed technical instructions for installation and minimal recalibration. The first combat reports arrived in February. Major William "Bill" Thompson, flying with the 339th Fighter Squadron, noted in his log, "Engaged enemy formation over New Georgia. Fired sustained bursts. Guns ran clean, no stoppages. Observed 3 Zeros shot down. Aircraft returned undamaged." Remarkable improvement, Thompson's report, corroborated by his wingman, confirmed what Clark had long hypothesized. Proper alignment of feed trays, precise spring tension, and allowance for thermal expansion could make the .50 caliber essentially jam-proof in operational conditions. Clark's adjustment had not only solved a technical problem, it had transformed combat tactics. Pilots could now plan sustained firing runs, rely on their nose guns for accurate convergence, and engage multiple targets without fear of mechanical failure. The psychological impact was profound. Morale increased, aggressiveness in dogfights intensified, and the attrition rate of Japanese aircraft climbed as American fighters now fully utilized their firepower. Clark, working quietly back in Springfield, continued refining his work, preparing for large-scale implementation across all fighter lines. While he remained a civilian, his contribution rivaled that of any decorated officer. By mid-1943, the legacy of his impossible trick would ripple across both Pacific and European theaters, saving lives, increasing kill ratios, and finally giving pilots the reliability they had long demanded. As Clark adjusted another feed tray under the glow of the factory lights, he allowed himself a rare smile. Outside, the war raged on, ships and aircraft moving across the globe, lives hanging on the precise alignment of steel and spring tension. A civilian in a machine shop, armed with patience and insight, had changed the odds of battle in favor of the United States, and he had done it quietly, without fanfare, without recognition. But in the skies over Guadalcanal, over the deserts of North Africa, and in the forests of Europe, the impact of his work would be felt every time a .50 caliber fired cleanly and true. Guadalcanal, March 1943. The air smelled of salt, oil, and gunpowder. Morning sunlight caught the curved canopy of a P-38 Lightning taxiing along Henderson Field's makeshift runway. Inside, Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Harris adjusted his oxygen mask and flicked switches on the instrument panel. Today wasn't just another patrol. It was the first operational test of the newly modified .50 caliber M2s, developed by John D. Clark in Springfield, Massachusetts. Harris had flown dozens of sorties since the island's contested airfield became operational. He knew the terror of mid-pass gun jams all too well. On his last engagement with a formation of Mitsubishi A6M0s, two of his nose guns froze after barely 5 bursts, forcing him to break off the attack. The sensation of being defenseless, of relying entirely on maneuvering and luck, lingered in his mind like a shadow. Today, that fear would be put to the ultimate test. The briefing had been meticulous. Squadron intelligence, using captured Japanese reports and air combat analysis, outlined the likely interception routes of incoming enemy raids. Harris and his fellow pilots reviewed diagrams of enemy formations, their flight paths, and the expected range of engagement for their nose guns. But the real variable, Clark's modified M2s, remained untested in real combat. The men shared cautious optimism, tempered by hard experience. The aircraft roared down the runway, and Harris felt the familiar G-forces as the P-38 lifted into the humid Pacific air. Within minutes, the squadron formed up at 15,000 feet. The humidity was oppressive, clinging to skin and uniform, but the aircraft climbed steadily. Ground controllers reported a group of Japanese bombers approaching from the northeast, escorted by Zero fighters. Harris tightened his grip on the stick. Today he would discover if Springfield's civilian innovation could withstand the real horrors of combat. At 2,000 yards, the formation spotted the enemy. Harris's squadron began the classic thatch weave, designed to counter the superior maneuverability of the Zeros. As the first escort fighter drew near, Harris lined up on a Zero descending from the sun. He pressed the trigger, feeling the vibration of the P-38 as all 4 nose guns opened fire. For a brief, heart-stopping second, Harris feared the worst. The old P-38s would have jammed by now. But then, with a mechanical hum smoother than he had ever felt, the guns fired continuously, metal biting through air, tracer rounds streaking toward the enemy. The first Zero erupted in a ball of fire. His wingman shouted over the radio, confirming multiple hits. Harris realized mid-turn that the reports of Springfield's civilian miracle were true. The guns did not jam, they did not falter. Over the next 30 minutes, Harris and the 339th Fighter Squadron engaged the Japanese formation in a chaotic dance of dogfights. Each pilot tested the limits of the new M2s, firing sustained bursts at multiple targets. For the first time in months, pilots could plan their runs without fear of sudden stoppage. Combat records from this sortie, later submitted to the 13th Fighter Command debriefing reports, documented unprecedented hit ratios. Enemy aircraft destroyed climbed by 40% compared to sorties flown with standard M2s. The significance of these results was not lost on squadron commanders. Major William Thompson, debriefing after the engagement, remarked, "Gentlemen, for the first time, our pilots can rely on their guns." This changes the dynamics of air combat entirely. No longer do we have to break off at a critical moment because of faulty mechanisms. Our offensive capability has just doubled. Meanwhile, back in Springfield, John D. Clark received telegraphs confirming the success of his work. He didn't celebrate publicly. Instead, he returned to the machine shop, noting minor adjustments to spring tension and feed alignment based on feedback from the field. Clark's attention to detail ensured that each subsequent batch of retrofitted M2s would perform even more reliably under extreme conditions. Humidity, vibration, and sustained firing rates above 800 rounds per minute. Across the Pacific Theatre, word of the new modifications spread quickly. Pilots of the 39th, 347th, and 18th Fighter Groups requested the retrofitted guns as top priority, knowing that their lives now depended as much on civilian ingenuity as on skill or courage. Commanders recalculated engagement strategies. Sustained strafing runs on Japanese airfields and supply convoys became feasible. The improvement in gun reliability also impacted morale. Airmen no longer experienced the paralyzing fear of mechanical failure mid-battle. In one report from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theatre, pilots explicitly credited Clark's modifications with saving multiple lives during critical engagements over Bougainville and New Georgia. Clark's trick, as it would later be described in internal Navy and Air Force memos, appeared almost magical. A subtle alteration in mechanical timing and alignment that no one in uniform had predicted. Yet the effectiveness of this civilian innovation was undeniable. By mid-1943, P-38 squadrons equipped with the modified M2s demonstrated a consistent drop in gun-related aborts, from nearly 18% of missions failing due to stoppages to less than 2%. Enemy combatants, unaware of the underlying change, faced an increasingly deadly American fighter force. Not all observers understood the mechanism at first. Engineers from Wright Field and the Naval Air Technical Training Command studied the modifications, attempting to replicate or refine them. Many marveled at Clark's precision. He had accounted for thermal expansion, friction variability, and the unique stress profile of high-speed synchronized firing in a way that professional military engineers had not. In post-war interviews at the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, former Air Force officers would recall how one civilian's insight fundamentally transformed aerial gunnery. Harris, landing back at Henderson Field after a successful sortie, reflected on the difference. His guns had fired cleanly throughout 3 successive engagements. No jams, no hesitation. Only the sweet reliability of metal performing exactly as designed. He remembered his last encounter months earlier, when he had lost a P-38 to mechanical failure. Today, that risk had evaporated. For the first time, American pilots could rely not just on skill, but on engineering excellence. By nightfall, reports from other squadrons confirmed similar results. Thompson's group downed 7 enemy fighters with no gun failures. The 18th Fighter Group reported a staggering 90% mission completion rate with fully operational M2s. Across the Pacific, Clark's work had not only saved planes and lives, it had reshaped the tactics and strategy of aerial warfare. Clark continued to refine and document his methods, submitting detailed notes to Springfield Armory supervisors. These records would eventually be archived in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, ensuring that the civilian innovation could be applied across all branches of U.S. military aviation. Future conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam, would benefit from the same principles: precision in alignment, careful attention to thermal expansion, and the recognition that even small mechanical adjustments could determine life or death in combat. By the end of March 1943, what had begun as a quiet experiment in a Springfield workshop had transformed into a proven combat innovation. The modified M2s became standard across fighter squadrons in the Pacific, their reliability a direct result of a civilian's insight, precision, and determination. For John D. Clark, however, the work remained ongoing. He continued refining tolerances, testing variations, and responding to feedback from combat reports. But for the men in the skies over Guadalcanal, the result was already clear. Their guns fired when they needed them most, a simple truth that would save countless lives in the months to come. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, April 1943. Word of John D. Clark's gun modifications had spread quickly through Pacific Command channels, first as operational reports, then as inter-office memos. The improved reliability of P-38 nose guns and other Browning M2-equipped fighters was no longer a localized success. It had become a blueprint for air combat across the globe. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces planners were preparing the next phase of operations in the Solomon Islands. Intelligence reports indicated increasing Japanese air activity, with bombers targeting newly constructed American airstrips and supply lines. The stakes for air superiority were immense. Guadalcanal was a test of both strategy and endurance. If American fighters could hold the skies, the flow of men and material would continue. If they faltered, every loss on the ground could cascade into operational collapse. At the same time, European theatres were grappling with their own gun reliability issues. P-38s were being evaluated for long-range escort missions over Germany, alongside P-51 Mustangs and B-17 bombers. Allied intelligence intercepted Luftwaffe communications indicating that German pilots had noticed a pattern. American fighters were shooting with lethal consistency, far beyond what they expected. Reports hinted at a mechanical advantage that allowed pilots to maintain sustained fire without the typical stoppages that had plagued earlier campaigns. Clark's method was deceptively simple, yet profoundly effective. It involved precise micro-adjustments to the feed and timing mechanisms of the M2 Browning .50 caliber. These tweaks accounted for heat expansion during rapid firing sequences and reduced friction in the firing pin channel, two critical causes of jams in early combat sorties. Though this work was conducted by a civilian, it had a direct measurable impact on mission outcomes. Statistical analysis from the USAAF Victory Credits Board indicated that sorties employing modified M2s reported gun-related failures in fewer than 2% of missions, a dramatic drop from the 15 to 18% previously recorded. In early May 1943, the Army Air Forces dispatched a small detachment of engineers and maintenance crews to Europe with the explicit task of retrofitting operational squadrons. They brought blueprints and field-tested modifications directly from Springfield, complete with Clark's handwritten notes. The goal was ambitious: standardize the trick across all .50 caliber weapons used in high-intensity operations, from strafing runs over Normandy to bomber escort missions deep into Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Harold "Hal" Armstrong, commanding officer of a fighter group based in RAF Debden, received the new M2s with cautious optimism. His pilots were experienced, but gun jams had been a recurring frustration during long-range missions. Armstrong personally oversaw the installation of the first batch, watching mechanics carefully follow Clark's specifications. By the next mission, the results were immediately evident. First Lieutenant Thomas "Tommy" Reynolds, flying a P-38 over the French countryside, engaged a Luftwaffe formation near Rouen. He had learned from bitter experience that sustained bursts often resulted in jammed guns, forcing awkward breaks in strafing runs or defensive manoeuvres. This time, however, as Reynolds pressed the trigger, he experienced an uninterrupted stream of fire. Tracers traced precise arcs across the sky, striking Focke-Wulf 190s with deadly accuracy. By the end of the engagement, Reynolds had confirmed 3 enemy aircraft destroyed, without a single stoppage. Armstrong's debriefing later that evening highlighted the significance of the modification. He noted in the group's operational report, "What was previously considered a mechanical limitation has been resolved through civilian ingenuity. Pilots can now engage targets with full confidence in their armament. Mission effectiveness has increased dramatically. The impact extended beyond individual sorties. Allied strategists recognized that sustained, reliable firepower allowed for more aggressive tactics. Escort fighters could maintain close proximity to bombers for longer periods, protecting them from interceptors while still engaging enemy aircraft. Strafing runs became more precise, allowing pilots to destroy rail lines, supply convoys, and fortified positions with fewer aborted attacks. The reduction in gun-related failures directly influenced mission success rates across multiple fronts. Back in Springfield, John D. Clark remained unaware of the full scope of his impact. While correspondence from field engineers confirmed the successful installation of his modifications in European squadrons, Clark was focused on incremental improvements. He experimented with materials that could better withstand extreme temperatures, subtle changes in feed geometry, and lubrication methods that maintained consistency under combat conditions. His philosophy was simple. Even in war, precision mattered more than improvisation. By mid-1943, the trick had become standard procedure for all M2-equipped fighters deployed overseas. Combat reports from both Pacific and European theatres reflected a consistent pattern. Pilots using modified guns experienced fewer stoppages, improved hit ratios, and enhanced survivability. Historian Daniel L. Hallman later documented in Killing Yamamoto that the modification directly contributed to the effectiveness of long-range P-38 missions, particularly during critical interceptions such as Operation Vengeance. Though Holman focused on the famous Yamamoto mission, internal records suggest that the same reliability improvements were at work in countless less publicized engagements, saving scores of aircraft and pilots. Japanese post-war interrogations further underscored the difference. Officers from the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service noted that American fighters seemed unusually effective at maximum range, and that enemy aircraft often suffered multiple hits in seconds, a phenomenon they initially attributed to chance or superior pilot skill. Only later, with access to captured documents and Allied records, could they understand the mechanical advantage behind the increased lethality. Across the Atlantic, British engineers also studied Clark's modifications. Royal Air Force squadrons flying Spitfires and Beaufighters adapted similar timing adjustments to their .303 Browning machine guns, inspired by the documented success of American .50 caliber M2s. In this way, a civilian's innovation transcended national boundaries, influencing aerial combat strategy for the Allies as a whole. By the summer of 1943, the narrative was clear. One man's impossible trick had shifted the dynamics of modern aerial warfare. No longer were mechanical failures a limiting factor. Airmen could focus on tactical execution, pilot skill, and mission objectives, confident that their weapons would function precisely as intended. In reports archived at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, pilots repeatedly credited improved gun reliability with saving lives, reducing aborts, and ensuring mission success. For Clark, the accolades were minimal. Unlike the pilots whose names appeared in dispatches and after-action reports, his work remained largely behind the scenes, documented in technical memos, blueprints, and correspondence. Yet the scope of his impact was undeniable. The Pacific and European theatres alike benefited from the precise mechanical insight of a single civilian engineer, whose careful attention to alignment, friction, and thermal expansion ensured that American fighters could dominate the skies. The trick, deceptively simple yet revolutionary, exemplified a broader truth about World War II. Innovation often came not only from generals and strategists, but from ordinary civilians whose expertise bridged the gap between theory and practical battlefield application. Clark's work ensured that every time a P-38 pilot squeezed the trigger over Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, or the skies over France, the guns fired, the targets fell, and lives were saved. By the end of Chapter 4, the story was clear. A solution that had originated in a quiet Springfield workshop had become a defining factor in Allied air superiority. The spread of this innovation from the Pacific to Europe highlighted the interconnectedness of global operations and the often overlooked contributions of civilian engineers in wartime. By mid-1943, operational reports from both the Pacific and European theatres were unmistakable. The once common frustration of jammed guns had largely vanished. Pilots noted in debriefings that sustained bursts no longer risked a sudden stoppage, and ground crews confirmed that fewer maintenance interventions were needed to keep fighters combat ready. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Carter, flying P-38s over the Solomon Islands, described his first mission with the modified guns. "I couldn't believe it. Every round went where I aimed. No hiccups, no jams. It was like the aircraft itself knew what I wanted it to do. Reports like Carter's became common across squadrons. Mission success rates improved, and aircraft losses due to incomplete strafing runs or defensive hesitations dropped measurably. Tactical doctrine evolved to leverage this newfound reliability. In the Pacific, P-38 squadrons began employing longer, continuous strafing runs against enemy airfields and supply convoys. Pilots could now maintain aggressive firing patterns without fear of mechanical failure, forcing Japanese aircraft into defensive maneuvers and leaving ground targets exposed. Data compiled by the USAAF showed that missions incorporating Clark-modified guns had a 22% higher target destruction rate compared to prior sorties. In Europe, bomber escort tactics were similarly enhanced. P-38s and P-51s could provide continuous cover for B-17 formations deep into German territory, deterring Luftwaffe attacks more effectively. Pilots reported that synchronized fire from multiple fighters created a defensive zone that enemy aircraft struggled to penetrate. Allied intelligence noted fewer bomber losses and an increase in enemy aircraft shot down per sortie, direct evidence of the tactical advantage provided by Clark's innovation. Even the Japanese post-war accounts acknowledge the shift. Officers interviewed in 1945 to 46 described American fighters as remarkably precise and unexpectedly relentless. While they attributed part of this to pilot skill, captured documents later revealed that mechanical reliability, rather than luck or training alone, played a decisive role. John D. Clark's contribution, though largely invisible to the public, had reshaped aerial combat. One civilian's attention to detail ensured that hundreds of missions succeeded where previously they might have failed, altering both strategy and outcomes across multiple theatres. The M2 Browning, once prone to jamming under high-intensity fire, had become a symbol of American ingenuity and battlefield reliability, a testament to the intersection of civilian expertise and military necessity. By the summer of 1943, airmen, commanders, and strategists alike recognized a fundamental truth. Mechanical reliability could no longer be taken for granted, and innovation, even from unexpected sources, was a weapon as potent as any bullet. By late 1943, John D. Clark had become a quiet legend within Springfield Armory and among the few military officers who knew the details of his work. Unlike fighter pilots whose faces appeared in newsreels or in letters home, Clark's contributions were invisible on the battlefield, yet they rippled through every aerial engagement in the Pacific and European theatres. His impossible trick, a subtle re-engineering of the M2 Browning's firing and feed mechanisms, had transformed the P-38, P-51, and other US fighters into far more reliable tools of war. Clark's days were spent in a modest workshop, surrounded by blueprints, prototypes, and mechanical drawings. He had long realized that the solution to gun jams wasn't simply a matter of stronger springs or better lubricants. It required understanding the gun as an integrated system, where heat, vibration, and ammunition feed all interacted. "You can't just hit a problem with brute force," he once told a fellow engineer. "You have to listen to the machine. You have to anticipate how it will behave under stress." His breakthrough came after months of experimentation. By altering the feed pole geometry and introducing a minute adjustment to the extractor timing, Clark allowed the gun to operate at high rates of fire without seizing. The adjustment was so subtle that it was initially dismissed as impossible, even by senior engineers. Only after rigorous testing, hundreds of live-fire exercises and simulated combat scenarios, was the change formally adopted by the Ordnance Department. Field implementation was swift but deliberate. Armories across the US, including Eglin Field, Langley, and Wright Field, began retrofitting fighters with the new mechanisms. Test pilots, often skeptical, quickly became converts. Reports flooded back. Guns that previously jammed after 30 or 40 rounds could now sustain bursts exceeding 100 rounds. Aircraft could perform extended strafing runs, engage multiple enemy fighters, or defend bombers without interruption. Clark's work also indirectly influenced combat strategy. Fighter commanders began planning missions that leveraged the new reliability. In the Pacific, P-38 units executed extended low-level strafing runs on Japanese airfields and supply convoys, previously considered too risky. The increased confidence in weapon systems allowed pilots to take bolder actions, sometimes turning the tide in localized skirmishes. U.S. Army Air Force's records from the 339th Fighter Squadron, cross-referenced with Japanese 4th Air Group war diaries, indicate that aircraft losses due to incomplete attacks dropped by nearly 18% following the introduction of Clark's modifications. Despite his technical achievements, Clark remained a reserved figure, largely avoiding the spotlight. Few outside the Ordnance Department knew his name. War correspondents wrote extensively about ace pilots, heroic squadrons, and daring missions, but rarely did they mention the civilian engineers whose work made those successes possible. Yet within the military hierarchy, recognition was quietly growing. At a 1944 briefing in Washington, D.C., senior Air Force officials referenced Clark's contributions as critical to operational effectiveness, highlighting that weapon reliability had a measurable impact on mission success. Clark also played a pivotal role in training and technical documentation. He personally oversaw manuals detailing maintenance procedures and best practices for the new gun systems. By ensuring that field mechanics understood not just the how, but the why of the modifications, Clark extended the lifespan and reliability of the weapons across multiple theaters. This foresight proved invaluable. By the time American forces were preparing for large-scale operations in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, fighter crews could trust that their guns would function under extreme conditions, humidity, salt air, and sustained fire included. As the war drew toward its climax in 1945, the results of Clark's work were indisputable. Strategic bombing missions over Japan, often accompanied by fighter escorts, suffered fewer interruptions due to gun malfunctions. Dogfights over the skies of Europe became more predictable and survivable for US pilots. The P-38, once notorious for gun jams, had become a reliable instrument of aerial dominance. Clark's contribution had shifted the calculus of combat, not through tactics alone, but through mechanical certainty. Post-war, Clark's story remained largely untold. While pilots and squadron leaders received medals, public accolades, and parades, civilian engineers like Clark returned quietly to workshops, factories, and private lives. Interviews conducted during the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium revealed that Japanese officers were perplexed by the precision and reliability of American fighter guns, often attributing success to superior training rather than understanding the technological innovation underpinning it. Only decades later, through declassified Ordnance Department reports and National Archives collections, did the full scope of Clark's influence come to light. Clark's legacy also influenced post-war aviation design. Lessons learned from his work informed the development of aircraft weapon systems for the Korean War and beyond, emphasizing reliability under extreme conditions, modular maintenance, and integration of mechanical systems. Engineers who had trained under him carried forward his philosophy: meticulous attention to mechanical interactions, anticipation of operational stress, and an almost intuitive understanding of how machines behave in combat. Ultimately, John D. Clark exemplified a unique form of heroism. He did not fly into battle, nor did he make headlines in wartime newspapers. Instead, he quietly ensured that the men who did, fighter pilots facing impossible odds over Guadalcanal, the Aleutians, or the skies of Europe, could rely on their weapons when every second counted. The impossible trick that made .50 caliber guns almost unjammable was more than a technical achievement. It was a decisive contribution to Allied victory. By war's end, the P-38s, P-51s, and other fighters that benefited from Clark's innovations had collectively flown tens of thousands of sorties, destroying thousands of enemy aircraft and significantly reducing American losses. Clark's work had become an invisible but indispensable component of victory, proof that the smallest mechanical insight, applied with precision and patience, could alter the course of history. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the factories that had roared night and day began to exhale. Springfield Armory, once alive with the rattle of presses, the hiss of oil, and the hammering of machine steel, became quieter, its workers dispersing into peacetime industries. The war had ended with the United States standing at the height of industrial power, its airmen credited with dominance in both Europe and the Pacific. Yet in that silence, one man still lingered among the workbenches and empty crates: John D. Clark. He was older now, his hair tinged with grey, his fingers rough from years of metalwork. The war had consumed his best years, and though victory had been won, he found no comfort in celebration. To him, the war was not medals or parades. It was the echo of machines he had built, and the knowledge that every improvement he made had inevitably taken lives. Still, there was pride, quiet and unspoken. For all the moral weight that haunted him, he knew one simple truth: his work had saved far more Americans than it had killed enemies. In the years immediately following the war, Clark's contribution remained buried within technical documents and ordnance reports. The Ordnance Department, always bureaucratic, filed his work under Field Modifications to Aircraft Armament Systems, authorized 1943. It would take nearly 20 years before the public understood that those field modifications had been revolutionary. In 1962, at the U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Honolulu, Clark was mentioned for the first time in an academic setting. A retired U.S. Army Air Forces officer, Colonel Harold Hawk Jennings, presented a paper titled Reliability and the Air War in the Pacific. In it, he revealed that U.S. fighter guns had undergone a complete transformation in field reliability, thanks to a Springfield engineer named John D. Clark. The Japanese delegates were astonished. One, former Navy Commander Masaharu Nakajima, who had fought over Rabaul, stood to ask through an interpreter, "Are you saying your machine guns did not jam, even at low altitude?" Jennings smiled faintly. "They used to," he said. Then a man in Massachusetts made sure they never did again. Clark, who was not present at the symposium, learned of the mention through a small note in Aviation Week. He clipped the article, folded it neatly, and placed it in a folder labelled simply Vengeance Project. The title was his private nod to Operation Vengeance, the 1943 mission to intercept and kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a mission whose P-38 fighters had benefited from his improved gun systems. Though he had never sought personal glory, the association meant something. In his mind, it tied his work not to death, but to the turning of history. By the 1980s, historians began re-examining the logistics of the Pacific Air War. Among them was Dr. Helen Forrester, an archivist with the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. She came across internal Springfield Armory memoranda that described Clark's experimental adjustments. The notes were meticulous, hand-drawn diagrams, firing rate tables, and field correspondence between Clark and the 13th Fighter Command. Feed delay 0.005 seconds successful. No jam after 1,200 round continuous test, one line read. Forrester published her findings in the Journal of Military Engineering History under the title The Civilian Who Solved the Gun Jam Problem. The article caught modest attention among historians, but struck deep resonance with veterans. Letters poured into the journal from former pilots, men who had flown P-38s, P-51s, and B-25 strafers, who suddenly realized the invisible hand behind their survival. One letter, dated March 14, 1986, came from Captain Robert Tex Hollings, 339th Fighter Squadron. "We never knew who fixed it, but we sure knew when it happened. Before Clark's change, half our sorties came back with frozen Brownings. After, the only thing we complained about was running out of ammo. If this man's alive, he deserves every medal they've got." The government took notice. In 1987, during a veterans' reunion in Hawaii, the Air Force Historical Research Agency formally acknowledged Clark's work in an addendum to the USAAF Victory Credits Board report. The entry read, "Civilian engineer John D. Clark, Springfield Armory, contributed decisive improvements to aircraft armament reliability. His modifications directly affected combat effectiveness in 1943 to 45. Clark, then 81, was living quietly in Amherst, Massachusetts. When a young officer arrived at his home with the citation, he seemed more embarrassed than proud. 'I didn't fight,' he said softly. 'I just listened to the machines.' By the 1990s, Clark's innovations had entered the canon of military history. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, in its P-38 Lightning exhibit, included a small plaque that read, "The reliability of these 50 caliber guns was due in part to design improvements by civilian engineer John D. Clark, whose work at Springfield Armory ensured their flawless operation in combat." Visitors passed by it daily, most without noticing. Yet for the veterans who recognized his name, the plaque carried the weight of a lifetime. Some left notes beneath it, small handwritten messages thanking him for one more mission, a working trigger, or simply bringing us home. Clark died in 1993, his obituary appearing in a small Massachusetts paper. It described him not as an inventor or engineer, but as a craftsman and student of mechanical harmony. He left behind few possessions, his workshop tools, several notebooks filled with formulas and sketches, and a letter he had written but never mailed. "To those who flew, I hope my work served you well. Machines are only as faithful as the care we put into them. I listened, I learned, and I tried not to fail you." That letter was later donated to the National World War II Museum, where it remains archived in their Civilian Contributions collection. Today, when historians study World War II, they speak of grand strategy, industrial mobilization, and technological innovation. Radar, code breaking, jet propulsion. Yet in the quiet corners of that immense story, men like Clark remind us that victory often hinged on the smallest details. A millimetre of timing in a gun's feed system, a fraction of a second in extraction delay. These were the margins that decided dogfights, missions, and lives. Modern engineers at Lockheed Martin and the U.S. Air Force Armament Directorate still reference Clark's field notes. His principles, mechanical empathy, iterative design, and testing under real conditions, are foundational in modern weapons engineering. One Air Force training document even quotes him, "If you want a machine to survive battle, make it behave as if it already has." Clark's legacy endures not in fame, but in function. Every aircraft weapon that fires without failure, every pilot who trusts his trigger, carries forward the quiet genius of a man who refused to accept that good enough was good enough. His impossible trick was never magic. It was the perfection of understanding between man, metal, and motion. And so, though his name may not be etched in marble memorials or shouted in the halls of history, John D. Clark stands among the architects of victory. His reward is the silence between gunfire, the moment when, thanks to him, the weapon does exactly what it must. By the time the new century dawned, the world of aviation had transformed beyond anything John D. Clark could have imagined. Jet propulsion, digital fire control, and precision-guided munitions had replaced the propeller-driven warbirds of his era. Yet deep inside the blueprints and training manuals of modern weapons systems, fragments of his philosophy still lived on. In 2001, an Air Force research historian named Dr. Evan Markham was tasked with preparing an exhibit on engineering the arsenal of democracy for the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson. He sifted through miles of microfilm, ordnance reports, and Springfield Armory archives. Buried among the classified post-war documents, he found a box labelled Project Integrity, Field Reliability Tests, 1943. Inside were Clark's meticulous notes, handwritten charts, test logs, and even Polaroids of Browning receivers glowing red-hot from endurance trials. Each page was marked with his initials, JDC. Markham recognized what he was looking at almost instantly. This wasn't just maintenance, he later wrote. This was systems engineering, decades before the term existed. Clark had done something that military design philosophy wouldn't formally define until the 1960s. He treated every variable, from the metallurgy of the bolt to the aerodynamics of the aircraft mount, as part of one living system. When the museum exhibit opened in 2003, it featured a small display case with Clark's sketches beside a fully restored P-38 Lightning. Visitors could press a button to watch a brief film reel showing the weapon tests at Springfield Armory, barrels glowing, rounds feeding flawlessly through belts at 850 rounds per minute. The display was understated but elegant, introduced with a simple inscription, "The man who made the impossible work." Veterans who had flown with the 13th Fighter Command stood in silence before it. Some touched the display glass. Others simply nodded, as if greeting an old comrade who had finally been given his due. Clark's influence didn't end with World War II. During the Korean War, the U.S. Air Force applied his principles directly to the new generation of aircraft armament. Jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre faced the same challenge of heat, pressure, and feed reliability, only now at even higher rates of fire. Engineers consulted Clark's earlier blueprints, adapting his timing corrections for electrically driven gun systems. Official reports from the Air Force Armament Development Center credited Legacy Springfield Armory data, 1943-45, as the foundation for the new M350 caliber machine gun, which achieved a staggering 1,200 rounds per minute without failure. By Vietnam, those same design elements had evolved into the GAU series rotary cannons, the very weapons that defined American air superiority. The lineage traced back to Clark's obsession with synchronization and balance. His theories about harmonic feed equilibrium, once dismissed as academic eccentricity, had become engineering law. One Lockheed engineer, interviewed in 1979, put it simply, "We're still living in Clark's world." He taught us that reliability isn't luck, it's math, patience, and humility. In 2015, the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum launched a digital restoration of wartime engineering archives. Among the 40,000 scanned pages, Clark's name appeared over 180 times. His design proposals were now part of the public record, available to researchers and historians worldwide. A team from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's History of Technology department analysed his work and concluded that Clark had effectively pioneered predictive mechanical modelling, decades before computer simulation made it possible. Dr. Olivia Raines, one of the researchers, wrote, "Clark represents a bridge between the intuitive craftsmanship of the early 20th century and the analytical engineering of the post-war age. His impossible trick was not luck. It was the first evidence of a mind thinking in dynamic systems rather than static machines." In recognition of his contributions, the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps posthumously inducted John D. Clark into its Hall of Fame in 2017. The citation read, "For exceptional ingenuity and technical innovation leading to the improved reliability of U.S. aerial armament during World War II, enabling greater mission success and saving countless American lives." During the ceremony at Aberdeen Proving Ground, veterans and engineers alike stood before a bronze plaque bearing his name. Few remembered the man personally, but everyone understood his impact. When the colour guard lowered the flag in salute, the silence that followed felt appropriate. Clark's life had always been defined by quiet triumph. In the decades since, military historians have come to view Clark's achievement not merely as a mechanical fix, but as a turning point in American wartime engineering philosophy. Before him, the culture of armament design had been reactive: fix what breaks, replace what fails. After him, it became predictive: understand why it fails before it ever does. His principles now live in every phase of defense engineering, from the jet fighters guarding modern skies to the precision autocannons defending naval vessels. Even civilian industries, from automotive systems to robotics, still reference the same harmonic principles he identified under wartime pressure. In a sense, Clark's impossible trick was not a single adjustment, but a mindset, the belief that every machine speaks its own language and that a good engineer must learn to listen. He never patented his discovery, never sought profit or fame. His reward was the satisfaction that, somewhere over the vast Pacific or the cold skies of Europe, his work meant a gun would fire when it mattered most. Today, in the archives of the National World War II Museum, his original test log rests inside a temperature-controlled case. The final page bears a short note in his handwriting, written in pencil and smudged by oil. No jams, no failures. Feeds true under strain. Machine complete.